gentlemen, thank you for joining us. My name is Ishan Jasuja. I'm a master's student here in international political economy with the King's Geopolitics Forum. And as you know, today we are here to talk about India and the evolution of India's foreign policy from non alignment to multi alignment and beyond. Thank you for joining us. This is going to be a panel discussion. And before diving in front of the sold out crowd, I would like to welcome our guests. So, if we could please take seats, Ms. Shehla Hasan with the CII, Mr. Pratik Dattani, and Dr. Amit Mukherjee from our very own King's India Institute.
It's okay. I'm sorry, do you want to sit down?
Oh, that's fine.
So, thank you very much for joining us. And before diving into the nuances and starting off, I would request you to please give a brief introduction of yourselves and deliver some opening remarks on multi alignment.
Ladies first. Do you want to go first?
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Shehla Hasan, and I head the Confederation of Indian Industry. I'm the director and head for the United Kingdom of the CII, which is India's largest and apex business association. So I have over 15 years experience in the UK-India economic bilateral corridor, having worked in the British High Commission in Delhi to heading the Confederation of British Industry for 9 years, then moving to Manchester to head the Manchester India Partnership, and now heading the CII here. So I'm more of a bilateral UK-India economic corridor expert rather than a multilateral speaker, but I'll try my best to add to the discussions. And about India, I think all I can say is it's probably India's time, it's coming of age of India in the global platform as an economic and political power. But we will discuss this later, so I'm just passing on to my co-panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Evening. First questions first. How do you fill up this room? So big. Like, I hope you guys have been paid for this. I hope you've been paid to attend, because I've never seen such a big audience in all my experience at King. So, congrats to the people organizing this. Thank you so much for inviting me and the other panelists. It's great to see you all. I'm like Mukherjee. I'm the acting director of the India Institute at King's. Previous to this, I was at RSIS in Singapore. I spent about 11 years there, so I'm fresh to this country. Much earlier than that, I was in the Indian Army, so my experience of India is very different. Forte, the work that I've done, the scholarship that I've done is India's defense and its security and kind of foreign policy. So in terms of my opening statements about this, I'll say three things. Firstly, if we talk about India as like the multi-alignment as a new plan, if you see it historically, it's a part of a continuity in Indian foreign policy. It's not really as much of a new plan. I don't want to put the organizers on a spot with that. It's a very provocative title. I think it's good to talk about it. It's not as much as a new plan, but there's a certain continuity when we think about how India has conceived and thought of itself historically, post-independence, that the experience of colonialism, the experience of being attached to a single power, being ruled by a sort of power, made post-independence Indians very wary of aligning clearly with any one power. So it's not a new plan. There's a historical kind of continuity to it. And three other things I'll say about this is, when we talk about Indian kind of foreign policy, the most important challenge that India faces is its own socio-economic development. When we look at economic parameters of maternal mortality, infant mortality, you know that India, although it has risen significantly in the last decade, but it has a significant challenges to overcome. These are related to poverty, these are related to equity, to environment, and when we look at per capita GDP, India is still 3,000, which is still very low. So if you look at those economic indicators, it's very clear to us that India's number one challenge is how to raise the living standards of its own people. And if that's its number one challenge, then especially in a democracy, the rulers have to be responsive to that challenge. And so the number one priority for India is socio-economic development. And anything else that comes in the way would be a distraction. Whether it be about illusions of great power, about taking on a new role, if any of that distracts from India's economic progress, the rulers would be well advised to sort of shirk away from a role that might distract India from its path of socio-economic development. So that's the first point, that India's new plan would be to benefit the people of India. Number two, India's foreign policy is wedded to its conception of itself. And the conception of itself is not just post-independence, it's pre-independence conception of itself. And the conception that Indians have about themselves and their part in the world has always been about not just thinking of itself as a civilizational power, right? I mean, it's not a surprise that if you think about the genesis of not just Hinduism, Sikhism, Jainism, Buddhism, Indians think of themselves not just as a spiritual power, because even though the world needs a lot more of spiritual progress at this day and age, but I'm not going to talk about this, not in this forum as yet. Perhaps one day on a temple service, I might end up there.
We'll do another event on that.
We might not do that event anytime because I'll be found out how bad I am that way. But India has always thought of itself as a different kind of civilization power, and this is even pre-independence. And so because it thinks of itself, its conception, its identity as a power in its own right, it will not follow any other power. It will not ally unless it is significantly, existentially threatened. And there were threats in India's history, post-independence history. When we think about the 62 China War, India was significantly threatened by China. And at that point of time, it did ally with the Americans. The Americans sent in arm and equipment to help them fight the Chinese. When India felt significantly threatened prior to the Bangladesh War, it was in a quasi-alliance with the Soviet Union. So having said all this about India would not be an ally, when times are tough, when interests are on the line, the country would do what is in the interests of its people. So that's the other part, that even though it will not ally, but India's self-conception of itself will ensure that it would not be in an alliance partnership with any power, in an explicit alliance partnership. And even in that case, alliances are a pre-Cold War era invention, right? There have been no real alliances that have come back after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the third aspect of this, and I would end with that, is Indians would do what is in the interests of India at that point of time, as all countries should, as all countries do. And so we should not distract ourselves with talk of principles and values, because if you talk about principles and values, all countries would come up short. But if we talk about interests, then that will form the basis for any partnership with India. So if any country wants to partner with India on the basis of interest, that makes the best of friendships, because those friendships are solid when you have interests that align. And when you talk about alignment of interests, I think it's very clear that India's interests align very much, if not perfectly, significantly, not just with the US, but a lot of Western democracies. Whether it is democracy, freedom of expression, and look, all of our countries are facing challenges on all these aspects, including democracy, freedom of expression, electoral democracy, or majoritarianism. There are challenges in all our countries. Having said that, when we think about an alignment of interests, India's interests align significantly with kind of Western countries, and that might form the basis for a partnership. I'll end it at that.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Great to see all of you. I have to start with two apologies. So the first apology is the picture you saw of me earlier at the back. I was smiling in that picture. After 2 months of Donald Trump, I don't know if I should still be smiling or I should have a different emotive reaction. So I apologize for that. The more I learn about geopolitics since the Trump 2.0 has started, the less I understand. So that's my big caveat with everything I say today. The second apology that I want to start off with is, I see, look around the room and I see lots of people who know far more about this topic than I do. We've got somebody who runs a global media business at the back. We've got somebody that works in human rights in India from IIM Ahmedabad and the US. Somebody who's worked on illicit sanctions as a day job at the back. So all of you collectively probably know far more about this topic than I do. That said, I just want to follow on from what we just heard in terms of whether India's new plan looks very much like the old plan. I completely agree that India's #1 development priority ought to be the upliftment of its people. So $2,500, $3,000 per capita GDP is nothing really to write home about. It's very similar to Bangladesh. Once India gets to 2-3 times that amount, that's when traditionally countries like Korea or Japan or China, when they've reached that much higher level of GDP per capita, that's when they've started to look abroad a lot more, use their economic diplomacy, their soft diplomacy a lot more. India is trying to do that much earlier. The ambition is wonderful. Does India have those resources? If you look in the PMO, how many people in the Delhi PMO, let's say, look after Eastern Europe or Central Europe as a subject matter? Compare that to how many equivalent people there might be in the Chinese government. You'll find there's a factor of 50 different. Sure, Eastern Europe might be a smaller place than Western Europe and economically and the UK, but that's the kind of challenge India has compared to the US and China. Of course, India's staff might compare a bit more favorably with the US's staff, given there's so many large-scale redundancies happening in Washington. But I think because India hasn't grown enough in terms of its GDP, it doesn't necessarily have the resource to match its aspirations on the global stage just yet. It will get there, but there will be quite some time before it does that. The latest GDP figures showed that in the last quarter, India grew at 6.2%. The last 2 quarters before that, India grew at 6.5%. In fact, that's the lowest growth, despite revisions in GDP, probably for a decade or decade and a half. So growth is trending down. In the last 2 quarters, in fact, agriculture grew more than manufacturing did. Services has been kind of at 7 and a bit % constantly. In part, this year's figures were, last 12 months figures were negatively impacted because India had elections, general elections a few months ago. And generally in the lead up to elections, government stopped spending money. And so a lot of the infrastructure spending and then the multiplier effects don't happen. So even stripping that aside, India's GDP is trending downwards and China's is trending upwards. In that scenario, can India be a bigger player than it is today on the global stage? Possibly, but it's got a lot of downside risks, which I'm sure we'll come on to. But I'll stop there in my opening remarks.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for setting the stage for what promises to be a very insightful discussion. And before we talk more about multi-alignment and how India is dealing with it, I want to talk about multipolarity. Let's define it for one. What is multipolarity, this phenomenon that we talk about with the emergence of different power centers around the world? How do you see multipolarity emerging in your respective fields? Is it a day-to-day phenomenon that you see while working in your industries and in your analyses?
So as far as the CII is concerned and our work is concerned, multipolarity definitely, we've been dealing with this not only now, but since many years, because the fact that the CII has got 8 overseas offices, and we are in the sense that we accord importance to the potential, even if it's not really happening now, but to future-proof the relationship. So we do have something like the Africa Conclave or the Latin American Conclave. So basically, we are looking at the whole world and the opportunities. Of course, the resources are definitely more on the Western part of the world, but And we also know that there is a balance of power which will be coming into play very soon, because multipolarity doesn't exist all the time. But as far as business is concerned, it is good to be looking at a multipolar world.
Dr. Mukherjee?
Thank you, Ishan. You are talking to a very good trained graduate student when he first starts with defining something, right? Defining multipolarity. I'm like, oh, that's what I tell all my students to do. First, define a concept. So again, I hate to do the kind of academic answer, but it depends on how you're defining multipolarity. And I think when we think about kind of multipolarity, when we look at the UN system, it's very clearly that there's a P5, which is the UN Security Council. So it depends on, are you seeing it economically? Are you seeing it diplomatically? Are you seeing it politically? And I think there's been a shift in the world when we think about the emergence of, let's say, new forums or new blocks. And I'm not just talking about the BRICS. I'm not just talking about, other, the SCO. I'm not just talking about the importance of ASEAN, but I'm thinking about where is the shifting centers of global power now? Economic power, right? Primarily economic power. When we think about domination of the West and Europe and North America, there's a gradual shift. When we think about population numbers, I think you're missing a big part of the future, what the future world would look like if you miss out the Indo-Pacific. Right? And when we think about the Indo-Pacific, how many of the countries across the Indo-Pacific are a part of the P5? If you include the US as an Indo-Pacific power, which is a little bit of a stretch, but if you were to do that, then two. Right? But the US is far off. China is the only one. And when you think about, there's that internet meme, which is more people stay inside this circle than outside the circle. But the global center, look at the population of Philippines, look at the population of Vietnam, look at the population of Indonesia. You are missing a trick. And so when we talk about the global south, which incidentally comes across very clearly when you apply for a Schengen visa, because that's the global south for you. But when we talk about the emergence of the global south, that itself is indicative of the fact that the people outside the Western dominated world, which has been the case for the last, 300-400 years, are starting to say that, we need a new world order. We need a different conception of order. And I think India is definitely, by any metric, not just population, not just economy, not just, in terms of the diplomatic value it brings to its engagement, and also the breadth of its engagement. So it's not anybody's real enemy except for one, and we're not going to talk about that power as yet. Hopefully it will not come up in the Q&A also, but it's not anybody's real enemy except for that one country who shall not be named as yet. But because of the range of its experiences, I think India qualifies as a part of any future like the multipolar world.
So I'm going to define it completely differently. Not academically, but if I think about where high net worth individuals and the most powerful people in the world live and choose to migrate, and use that as a proxy for power centers across the world. So the three countries across the world which have had the most high net worth individuals emigrate in the last 3 or 4 years has been India, Russia for obvious reasons, but then the UK as well. And from India, where have people gone? Let's say Singapore, Dubai, some in London and some elsewhere. And from the UK, where have people gone? So lots of my friends have now moved to Dubai and Abu Dhabi. Some have moved to Doha, some moved further afield. And the traditional centers of power used to be, so pre-2014, it was a kind of a joke that you could have, in English summer, you could more easily have an Indian cabinet meeting at the Taj in St. James than you could do in Delhi, which is now no longer true, because London is not the center of Lutyens Delhi's world when it's May and 45 degrees in Delhi. But a lot of that money, a lot of those grey monies as well, and therefore power, has moved to places like Dubai and Abu Dhabi, as well as Riyadh, as well as Doha. And these are places where in the Western liberal sense of the word, they are not the kind of places where you would want to put your money, because Western liberal ideals say, you need democracy and you need every person is valued equally and all that stuff. But actually, in a lot of the world, that's not true. And people in places like this are okay with it. Brits that work in finance in London and move to Dubai are perfectly okay with the fact that there's no elections, and the fact that somebody that works in your kitchen and somebody that is your boss in the investment bank you work with have completely different rights. So the way I define multipolar is these are some of the new financial power centers where money is moving to. Huge amounts of Russian money has moved to the Middle East because that's where the big funds are, that's where the big investors are. And that's where I think some of India's power that could have stayed in India and benefited India has also migrated out.
That's a very interesting point, because when we talk about multipolarity, we always see it as a political phenomenon. We don't really focus on where the money is. So I think that's a very unique and special insight that you've provided. The way I look at multipolarity and India's multi-alignment is that, yes, the power centers around the world have shifted, but so have India's capabilities and interests. So given our evolving interests and capabilities, I think we are now becoming more of an active part in international institutions, global policy making, and the global political economy in general. So given this, how do you think our interests are expanding in the Indo-Pacific or elsewhere in the world? From a political perspective, from an economic perspective, and Mr. Dattani, maybe you can talk more about how Indian money is shaping different regions and where it is going.
I think anyone.
So I'll comment quickly on this one. Since I'm also pretending to be an academic and a historian, post-independence India actually really played a very important part, and this is not that well known in the Western world, in the decolonization movement. And India was at the forefront. This decolonization is the term that we use to talk about how European powers were moved from areas that they previously colonized. In the decolonization struggle, India played a really important part. And although people in the West might not study it, might not know of it, but when we talk about India's connections with Indonesia, generations of leaders in Vietnam, Indonesia, they were talking to each other. The Global South existed in the kind of WhatsApp internet day. The people existed. There was a network of people who believed that they were fighting against the colonial oppressors. And there was a natural affinity. And the Indians were involved not just in 1947, but till 1960, till 1962 in decolonization struggles from Korea to Indochina to Vietnam to Lesotho to Africa. And it was, and India's diplomatically was at the forefront of it, because India was the only power that thought of itself as a bridging power between the East and the West, that could talk to the communist countries and the Western countries. And Nehru, Krishna Menon, his foreign minister, were actually actively consulted and were flying all across the world at the center of kind of mediation, of being the only country that could actually talk to both sides and had the trust of both sides. So this conception of India as a bridging power is significant. And I would say that echoes of that still carry on, right? It can still talk about the interests of the Global South because people understand that India's challenges are significantly in common with the countries in the Global South. Whether it be environmental, whether it be exploitation by corporations based in the West, or agenda-driven whatever kind of political pushes that come from the West, or NGO funding, some of it that can be aimed at certain sectors of the economy that might not suit Western corporations. So all of that are challenges that the developing world faces, that India also faces. At the same point of time, India is also able to have dinner with the Americans and lunch with the British and breakfast with the Russians. Right? I don't know where they are flying. I think at some point of time, but they can. They can talk to all powers. And so that unique conception of India as a bridging power still does continue, right? And so that's an kind of element of of that existed in the past. And so that's important to kind of keep in mind that that continuity still does kind of carry on. In terms of what it thinks about expanding interests, I think with India's growing GDP and external trade constitutes a significant part of India's GDP now. And because external trade consists a significant part of India's GDP, India is also interested in engaging all over the world. And I think you would see, I don't know enough about Africa, but at least in Southeast Asia, where I was there for 11 years, there is a hunger, an appetite, and a willingness to partner with India. And I think you would see that in Southeast Asia, you'd see that in Central Asia. You're increasingly seeing that in Eastern Europe and Western Europe, right? As you alluded to. Africa, I think also. So it is bound to happen that as India's economy grows, as the stakes in India's, it creates opportunities for other countries to also kind of partner with India.
Yeah. So if I take the African example, in East Africa, where my family has some business, when you come out of Kampala Airport, which is the capital of Uganda, before you exit the car park, you'll see a huge sign in Mandarin. And the sign is there because the Ugandan government very stupidly took a loan from the Chinese government and didn't know how to repay it, and therefore the Chinese government owns the the Kampala airport. And you don't see many Chinese people coming out to the airport, so not many people can actually read what's written in the big wall next to the car park. But once you come out, before 1972, when Idi Amin said he didn't like people with less melanin in their skin and they should all leave, before 1972, probably about 70% of the economy was run by Indians, or to some extent Pakistanis. Now, probably it's back to 50 to 60% of the economy being run by Indians, Pakistanis, or Chinese. In the DRC, next to Uganda, if you go to any pharmacy, for example, 95% of them will be Indian owned. Almost all the import-export of anything related to nutraceuticals, pharmaceuticals, etc. is done by Indians. Same with Kenya. If any of you live in northwest London, in between Stanmore and Pinner and that kind of area, out of the top 20 biggest Indian origin billionaires in East Africa, about 15 of them live in that 5-kilometer radius in northwest London. And so India has been really important for East Africa's economy, and the reason is Indians have worked well with the local Africans, whereas the Chinese approach to working with the governments have been very different, which has been to import Chinese labor, do the work, and then leave without doing any kind of transfer to locals. And that's been very much India's model, not just in East Africa, but I think across the continent. And I think that goes back to the kind of global power India wants to be, and also the Indian culture, which is very much that you come into a country and you try and assimilate, and if you can't assimilate, then at least you try and work with the locals as much as possible, which is not the Chinese way of doing things. And sometimes it is the US way of doing things, and sometimes it's not. So I think in a multipolar world where India is more important than it was 60 days ago before Trump, I think this way of doing business that India has, the softer way, which is not confrontational and which doesn't involve warring with people, I think that will stand it in very good stead.
So I'd like to go back to India's traditional foreign policy, in the sense that what was India's interest then, and what is India's interest now, and in that journey, I think I will probably not allude fully to the view that things haven't changed. Things have changed. Like when India was independent, became independent, and following the policy of non-alignment, I think till the 90s, Indian foreign policy and diplomacy, economic diplomacy, was more about securing foreign aid. from the Western world, as well as maintaining a very cordial relationship with the Eastern Bloc. But as we go along, since the 1991 payment crisis and India opened up to the world with the economic reforms, I think slowly India's role in the global realm has also been changing and perhaps improving. So I think one turning point happened in 1991, and perhaps now, with the uncertainty and the transactional turn that the world might be taking, led by the US, I think this could be India's second turning point. And right, like from negotiating foreign aid to actually giving aid to other countries, I think that's a huge journey which needs to be recognized. So, from the policy of non alignment to India coming on its own, and even when Ukraine happened and the West was completely against Russia, India still, although again, that whole non-confrontationalist approach, that okay, you guys are doing what you're doing, but we are not going to sever relationships just because you're having a war. So playing the good mediator, I think fighting the good fight um, is still very much in India's foreign policy, I would say. Its geopolitical interests are expanding. It is building itself up to providing more secure supply chains compared to, we won't name whoever you were saying, we will not, that is not to be named. So I think that whole effort of India, I would always say that it's just going from strength to strength. Definitely, we have poverty, the rich are getting richer and the poor poorer. There's a lot of opulence that is admired on social media, but on the ground, I don't think, the poor man is not interested in who's getting married and with how much of billions in dollars or diamonds. But I think, we are very so from that virtual reality, if you come back to the common man in India, of course there's a pride now in being Indian. I can say it for myself. India is recognized, the huge, the power of the diaspora. Indian diaspora is everywhere, and they are very active. And that pride in being Indian outside India is now a new situation compared to perhaps the 70s or the 80s.
I do completely agree. There has never been a time better than this to be an Indian.
Yes.
I would certainly say that, and I definitely do agree with your stance on the Russia-Ukraine conflict and how we have managed it as well. I think it has been a textbook exercise in strategic autonomy, and our Prime Minister has repeatedly said that India is not a neutral country in this conflict. We support peace, so we are in a camp. We are in the camp of peace, but we're still going to use this opportunity to maintain strategic autonomy, buy oil from Russia, which has really helped keep inflation down in the country. I mean, the West has been riddled with inflation, high interest rates, the growth is not well. But in India, we have been able to handle it quite well, I would say. So I just want to dive deeper into India's trade relations now. Of course, we've spoken about the US, we've spoken about Russia. But how do we optimize our trade relations to, say, with free trade agreements? We're in the process of negotiating one with the UK. What's your experience been with that? It's been a busy time for you, I'm pretty sure, and with the EU as well. Do you think that apart from these free trade agreements and India's look east policy that we were talking about a little bit earlier, can it serve as a template to forge new relationships with other emerging market trading blocs such as Africa or the Middle East?
So yeah, I'd like to go first on this. So of course, India's free trade agreements are not the only thing that it is seeking to future-proof its economic relationships. But then there are these bilateral relationships like the ISET with the US and the Technology Security Initiative with the UK, which was launched 6 months ago. I think it's the whole endeavor and is to um, seek secure, trustworthy supply chains, because it started with India wanting to be part of the global supply chain, and now it is forging relationships which focus on securing these supply chains after obviously the China experience. So, that building up trustworthy partners, I think that's very much on India's plate. And CII is the private sector delivery partner for the TSI for the UK. And we are working, and the private sector, therefore, is becoming quite important in these government to government relationships, especially because of collaborations. I would like to cite the example of India UK, and we are seeking to secure collaborations between private sectors across 7 sectors and cutting edge sectors like AI, semiconductor, quantum, critical minerals, health tech, and other, there are a few other sectors also. So if this is the crucible of collaborations between so many sectors, it's going to be a collaboration of collaboration, and all for the common interest, because I think the word common good is no longer that relevant. It's more common interests that we are working for, and that which India is working for. So TSI, where the private sector forms the fulcrum, the businesses form the fulcrum of that relationship, that's when businesses are also becoming strategic. So that's my and can you remind me what your question was about
the FTAs.
FTAs?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So FTA, of course, right now the Commonwealth with the new Secretary General coming in, she's very clear that she wants a FTA within the Commonwealth countries. B20 again, G20. We are looking, India is a very big part of the G20, and has projected itself as the global south, as the voice of the global south, by including Africa for the first time. So I think that whole idea of non-alignment and taking the rest of the world with you is still forms a big part of India's foreign policy today.
I want to hear this about FTA.
I think just touching a bit on the FTA. So while it's been in the press a lot over 3 prime ministers in the UK that the FTA is just around the corner,
Yeah.
I think whatever UK prime ministers have said, that's been more for a domestic audience consumption in a post-Brexit world to say, we are doing something, don't worry, something is happening. But on the Indian side, there's not been that same, regular updates as to what the status might be, whether we'll get it done by Diwali, as Boris Johnson said at one point, and then Liz Truss said she was going to get it done, etc. But the FTA between the 2 countries will form the basis of a several decades-long relationship. So I think it's perfectly reasonable that it takes 3 or 4 or 5 years. In fact, in terms of AI and critical minerals that Shehla spoke about, the world is a very different place today than it was when the FTA discussion started. DeepSeek didn't exist, OpenAI didn't exist, etc. At that time. So even within this time, the basis of the conversations in some of the sectors have changed. So it's perfectly fine that it takes a long time. It takes another year, and it takes another year and a half, as long as something is done. That said, a free trade agreement is not a panacea to solve all economic problems between the 2 countries. You can correct me on the numbers, but India is something like the 3rd largest investor in the UK. The second largest investor in the UK, and then the other way around also.
The 6th largest.
6th largest. And Indian companies employ something like 110,000 people in the UK.
120,000.
120,000. She knows the latest numbers. From about 815 companies.
Yes.
Yeah, that bit I got right.
It's 971.
971. Okay, there we go. So anyway, so directionally, India's doing good with the UK, and that's despite not having an FTA. So I think particularly when politicians talk about trade, I think they mix up 3 different things. One is trade in services, which is things like export of higher education, which will happen. I mean, you guys all evidence of it happening anyway, despite not there being an FTA. Then trade in goods, which is what the FTA is really about. And then investment, which is what the FTA is not about. And then migration, successive British prime ministers keep on confusing this, but that's a separate thing. However, I would say that the FTA with the EU that India has, I think it's 2.5 decades, 3 decades in the making, and still hasn't happened yet.
It's been a while. Let's just say that
It's been a while. So when in 2014 the current government in India came to power, I think they did away with all the bilateral investment treaties, and they haven't really been replaced yet. Likewise, on free trade agreements, I think given India wants to be more export orientated and increase that component of aggregate demand, the X minus M bit at the end, my view is India should spend a lot more time thinking about its FTAs and expanding exports, even if that means giving concessions. In the first term of Modi, there were a lot of big initiatives, big reforms that happened. In this third term so far, not much has happened, which seems like this is a huge supply side change that's going to change India for the better. There's been a lot of talk about cultural and social issues, but not so much on these big ticket reforms. And this is where I think, I'm assuming Modi's not going to be there forever, but if this is last term, or at least near his last term, then I think FTAs is the big thing that he can do to change India for the next 20 to 30 years.
And all of you have spoken a lot about artificial intelligence, emerging technologies, and I think what we've done well, because Dr. Mukherjee, you were talking about the inward challenges that India needs to look at in your opening remarks. The deployment of technology for governance, public infrastructure, social welfare, I think with things like the UPI, nobody's ever seen anything like it. And we are setting ourselves up very well for playing a critical role in cutting edge technologies such as artificial intelligence, semiconductors, etc., even the hardware part of it. For example, we hosted co-chaired the AI summit in Paris recently. We will be hosting the next one in India ourselves very soon. So let's talk about these emerging technologies and critical for growth. What are your thoughts on our positioning ourselves for AI and how technology has helped us solve our challenges so far? What opportunities exist?
So, I think this is also a great opportunity for India to take leadership in the digital transformation of the world. Because I had attended a meeting on digital transformation recently for the B20, which is going to happen in South Africa, and it's very sad. I'm very sad to say that 32% of the world population works without internet. So here we are talking about AI, whereas 32%, 1/3 of the global population is without internet. So can India, take that leadership of bringing internet to those areas? So that's the question, and how can AI help in that? I think that would be the biggest question we could try and answer. Going beyond that, I think AI space, sustainable development. There's only one thing I want to say about AI and all these futuristic technologies, that there has to be a strong global convention, a strong international regulation on the ethical side of the use of AI, because it could go horribly wrong, and AI also can bring back on the global agenda things like climate, sustainability, things that mankind is facing and should be fighting together. And we should be using AI for that, and the all important DEI agenda. It's in most discussions these days, it's increasingly becoming an elephant in the room. Nobody wants to talk about it after the White House speech. So, and there are multinational corporations who've dropped the DEI agenda, which I think is the cornerstone of inclusion. So, can we shape AI and AI related stuff? Things that are happening around us on these ethical parts, rather than going for short-term transactional glory and gain. That's all I have to say about AI.
I don't understand AI. I use it just to grade my student papers. Joke. That's a joke. I never used AI to grade anybody's papers. It's all the mistakes are my own. I do agree there's an opportunity for India to help in the digital transformation. And I think there are some good stories emerging out of India with the UPI especially.
Yes.
Right? And I think it's the ease with which you can pay for buying chaat in New Delhi off the street where you can have golgappas and you can like pay with your phone. And the fact that it's not that easy to do in advanced Western countries is a shocker. So that creates an opportunity. At the same point of time, and I don't want to be like the glass half empty and the half full, because we all know that everything you say about India, the opposite is also true, right? Which is, as much as we talk about the opportunities that India can bring to the world, I think when we look at the technology side of it, when we look at, let's say, even engineering, and we look at the basic sciences, when we look at innovation patents, when we look at that end of thing, the story is not all that great. That India also has significant challenges in its education sector to foster, let's say, basic science research or STEM or engineering research, right? And even for AI, I think India is sort of replicating elsewhere, not creating of its own. So I think that becomes a challenge. That as much as India brings a lot to the table, I think we should not also overlook the significant challenges that India faces back home to tap into the transformative power of AI. I don't even know what the transformative power of AI means, but I will just throw that in there.
I think two points. You mentioned the co-hosting something like the AI summit. In terms of hard money, just the amount of money that let's say the US and China can throw at economic diplomacy, India can't win in that space. But where India can compete favorably and where it may have comparative advantage is that kind of convening power. Because it's friends with lots of people, India can use its convening power to bring different stakeholders together. That soft power is a much cheaper way of building influence than harder ways of building influence. So I'm all for India hosting more and bringing different stakeholders together. On AI, I would take slightly contrarian view. If you look at the top 10 industrialists in India, from Adani's and Ambani's through to Birla's and Tata's, and you add up all the public announcements they've made about how much they're putting in generative AI, it's almost nothing. So India cannot lead the world in AI. I just don't agree. The biggest tech companies in the world are in China and the US. They're putting the largest investments. Even the Indian government schemes which are funding exciting AI startups in India, if you look at the quantum of money, it's 100x less than in China, or maybe 1,000x less. I don't know the exact numbers. So I think there is an opportunity for India in AI. I don't think it is in building the next DeepSeek. Having said that, in fintech, India does lead the world exactly because of the kind of things that have been talked about here. Aadhaar mixed with UPI and other fintech innovations. So I think that is something definitely India should be extremely proud of.
So I think one factor that's been brought up over here is the ownership of intellectual property and domestic innovation. We have to have innovation happening within our country in order to own the intellectual property to get the most benefit out of it. Otherwise, we are manufacturing becoming the world's assembly site where, let's be honest, there's not the most amount of value add happening. So given that, and there are a lot of Indian people in this crowd, and of course from other countries as well, 18 to 19 million Indian nationals live outside of India, abroad. I want to ask you, how can we leverage our people factor, and what can we do, especially the younger audience in this room, to take India forward, especially given the economic challenges that we face and given the political challenges that we face? So one piece of wise advice you would give all of us.
So I was looking at it from the other side, from the industry side,
Yes.
in the sense that, the kind of industry academia collaboration that happens in the West, whether it's the UK or the US or other countries, that's not there in India. The lab to market that journey is very long in India
Yes.
compared to what it is here. Here you have these industry academia clusters, whereas in India I don't see. I find that a missing, that missing. That link. So I would ask perhaps the faculties and the industries to talk to each other more and come up with cutting edge research so that we have more patents and innovations. We've got the IITs of the world, but I think that whole integration with the industry and doing industry led research, the consumer research that goes with it, I think all that needs to be integrated, which is not there.
That is great advice. What advice would I have for young Indians who are living outside India? Do one thing, do something beyond your own immediate family, at least one thing. I think focus on your own progress and economic growth. I mean, succeed first yourself before you start succeeding for others. So by all means, focus on your career, do what you want to do, live your life. But at the end of it all, just don't pine for an iPhone 24 or iPhone 25. That should not be the goal. But do something that is beyond the immediate interests of you and your own family, whatever that might be. And that I think would be a big help.
And I would say, so India's number one export, I would say, it's its diaspora.
Yeah.
In the UK, the richest person or the richest family in the UK is Indian. 3 of the top 20 richest families in the UK are Indian. The Prime Minister used to be Indian. The Deputy Mayor of London was Indian, etc., etc. The list goes on. And this is a great time to be part of the Indian diaspora, because if you came here in the 60s and 70s, you faced racism, you faced a lot of issues. The resilience that you had to have as 2 generations ago is very different to the world today, which is much easier to live in, much easier to thrive in as a young person. And so I would say be the best you can be as a representative of your country, so that Rishi Sunak isn't an anomaly, or J.D. Vance's wife is not an anomaly, Kamala Harris is not an anomaly. We have 1.5 billion people, 20-30 million people across the world. We can rule the world in a compassionate,
Democracy.
and a democratic way for the common good.
Yeah. I agree. And on those inspirational words, I think it is time to open up to the audience. Do we have any questions for our illustrious panelists? Oh my God. We'll have Aurel, Pranoy. Let's take 2 questions at once.
I have a feeling his one's going to be really difficult. So you can target it this way.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts and your insights. My name is Aurel Toblem. I'm the Middle East and North Africa editor here at KGF. Focusing more narrowly on the domestic economic issues, it seems to me that there is an increasing contingent of Indian youth who are resorting to, let's say, religio-political extremism as the perceived solution to the economic challenges of their day. Now, as India moves globally towards hopefully a more positive trajectory, what is likely to happen with that attitude? Are we likely to see a decline in extremist attitudes, or are we likely to simply see them stagnate and continue to be the same?
I feel like there's a very nice academic answer there, where I won't get in trouble.
I would say I would look for a definition of that, right? What are you defining as a militarized? That's one, right? But it's very hard to talk about the future. We don't know how the future is. The challenge, again, is about employment and jobs. I think that is a significant challenge. If India is able to grow equitably, and equitably is important here, and I think there is some evidence that there is an effort to make that happen, hopefully we will not see more of such radicalization. Having said that, that radicalization is there in all countries, whether it's Eastern Europe, whether it's London, whether it's the US. And I think that's a challenge. it could be lone wolf radicalization, it could be group radicalization. I think it's also yearns to a people's search for identity here, where they are sort of unmoved by the new world that they're dealing with. They might not have the tools to deal with this complexity of nucleus families, and so they're trying to find an identity. And if that identity is able to give them a positive direction and is able to help them grow economically, that's for the plus. But if it creates a us and them sentiment that divides the country, then that becomes a significant challenge for all of us. And I think the challenge for all of us is to make sure that the radicalization does not create a climate of us and them, of inclusiveness, and it helps for inclusive overall.
Yeah, I think when you have economic challenges, when young people turn to othering of people, that's usually a symptom of something else. So most people don't wake up in the morning and think, you know what, I'm going to be rude to this person today. That's my objective for the day. Most people want to get up and go to work, earn some money, go out for a beer, spend time with their family and friends. And if you don't have all that filling your day, then you're more ripe for, you're more susceptible to being fed answers for why you're in that position. That could be from the online misinformation space or disinformation space. That could be just you sitting in your room imagining lots of different things. And I think those challenges are there for populations across the world, just like Anit said. In India, there's a particular flavor, but equally it's true in the UK, equally it's true in the US. It's certainly true in the US. January the 6th happened a few years ago, not because any of those people were necessarily bad people. They got into a vacuum or in a kind of a vortex of misinformation, and they believed the US was under threat. They fundamentally believed that, and they felt that this was the way that they could express their views to better the US. That doesn't necessarily mean they wanted to break the country. It was just the wrong diagnosis that they had for a problem they may well have correctly identified. So I think job opportunities are really important. In India, manufacturing, so if you work in the services sector, which I said earlier has been growing at 7.5% a year for years and years, it's kind of in steady state. Services in India doesn't create that many careers. It creates jobs. So if you work in a shopping center, if you're a Uber Eats delivery guy, that's not a 40-year career. Manufacturing creates careers, but manufacturing as a percentage of GDP in India has fallen every single year for basically the last 20, 25 years. And so while there'll be a section of the population that can come up abroad and study abroad and then work here, much of India can't, particularly in tier 2 and tier 3 cities. And if those people don't have access to government jobs anymore because government isn't recruiting as much in India today as it used to, and secondly, the private sector opportunity is not there, then they're much more susceptible to some of these things.
I'd just say that, it's I agree with both the other speakers in the fact that, the lack of education, the lack of employment opportunities. When I last checked, I think there was 12 million a year was the unemployment number. So people need the jobs, and it's just the misguided youth through social media and the wrong messaging. I think that's something that's worrying, definitely. And but at the end of the day, I would say that I have a lot of faith in being intrinsically Indian. That whole idea of India has not really gone away as a lot of people might believe, because while you do hear instances of communal divisiveness, there are also lots of lovely examples of people coming together. So I wouldn't really say that things are going horribly wrong, but there are shades of things. There is politics of pretext, politics of opportunism, but we need a strong voice against it. But I still have a lot of faith in the Indian people of being together and having again common interests rather than common good.
Thank you very much for a very enlightening conversation so far. My name is Pinoy. I'm a researcher with the Economic and Trade Policy Center here at King's Think Tank. So there were a few remarks surrounding about potentially the amount of resources that could be allocated towards quite sensitive things like AI, and how there's that India is not at the level perhaps that the US or China might be. Where does resource optimization in such conversations stand? Because taking the example of the UK alone, you could have huge infrastructure projects that don't really deliver, like the network from London to Birmingham is still not being built, no matter how much money is being thrown at it. So, do you think there is something to be said about, I don't know, the Indian populace's ability to be, to create jugaad and be able to provide in that way?
Yeah, I mean, Indians are generally jugaru is one way of saying it, but I would say innovative and entrepreneurial would be the flip side of that, and that's reflective with the Indians that are around the world, running big tech companies in the US, running funds here, etc. So I think where that resource allocation from an Indian government perspective should be, that's an answer above my pay grade. I don't know. But certainly, I think to build influence around the world, India is better served deploying its human capital rather than money and hard power.
Any other additions?
No.
Lady Jack. Hi everyone, my name is Anika. I'm the Vice President for Indian National Students Association here at King's. My question was probably for Professor Amit Mukherjee, but both of you can also feel free to chime in. How do you think India's military alliances are shaping its diplomatic posture, at least in today's world where we are seeing a shift in the existing world order?
Thank you. Do you want to take a group of questions?
I think we should do that. Any other questions? We'll have the lady in red and then you.
Thank you. Thank you guys for providing such an insightful talk on India's foreign, to a certain extent, economic policies. My name is Sanjay Gurrajan. I'm the president of the KSL International Relations Society. My question would be in particular with respect to India's regional alliances with the Middle East, because we are seeing a lot of geopolitical changes with respect to the members of the Gulf Cooperation Council. We have the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Qatar pursuing their own regional alliances and leading into proxy wars and other civil wars. So how should India navigate past these complex geopolitical alliances, considering majority of the international financial wealth is coming to cities like Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Qatar and Riyadh, etc. So that would be my question. How would the navigation work out, and how longer will it take to have a free trade agreement with the Gulf Cooperation Council as a whole, considering that you have a lot of regional challenges within the Gulf Cooperation Council, right?
So we've got one question on military alliances, one question on Gulf Cooperation Council, and we'll take one more on
human rights and also to do. Hi, my name is Elahej Amali. I'm a British Iranian human rights activist, and I've been challenging the activities of the Islamic Republic within the UK and throughout the Middle East across Europe. So radicalization was brought up in one of the topics, and you also mentioned your work in military and anti-terrorism. There was also mentions of the fact that while there is while there's uprising of radicalization here and in the US equally, it is rising in India. What is being done about that? Because we very recently had a witness of a terrible attack, very much like October 7 on a Hindu community in India from Muslim communities in India. And how is all of this even, was it India or Bangladesh? My apologies.
That must be Bangladesh.
But regardless, what is India doing to, in relations to the Islamic Republic of Iran, connections with them, and radicalization of the youth in regards to religious radicalizations or human rights effects that come along with that.
So we'll proceed in the order of precedence.
Precedents, nay, just answer it quickly.
Yeah.
Very good question. Military alliances, India does not really have a military alliance. I won't use the term alliance. I'd say partnership. So alliances it has with smaller countries like Bhutan, Nepal, and Mauritius, but we don't talk about that too loudly. But what India does have is partnership with, and I think in terms of its partnership, the interesting thing to look into is look at the complexity and the scale of the military exercises it does with certain partners. And if you look at the complexity and the scale of the military exercises it does, it's very clear that India prefers certain partnership over others. While India diplomatically says it deals with everybody, but if you see the complexity of the exercises, the frequency of the exercises, and the type of exercises, it gives a very clear indicator of who the Indians think of as special friends, right? There are friends and then there are special friends. And here I would say that the US is probably on top of the list. So you have US, you have France, you have UK is starting to get there. You have Israel, you have Japan, you have Australia, and the Quad countries. So that gives a sort of it gives an indicator of the inner ring of what India thinks of as its preferred friends. You would never have an Indian official going on record saying that it has an inner ring. But if you had to use a proxy of the complexity of the exercise, that's an interesting way to think about it. In terms of the Gulf, I think the challenges are multifaceted, but the Indians would deal with the Gulf as it is, right? Despite its fractures and its fractured landscape. And I think that is also true about its engagement with Iran, right? I mean, while India would not want to see a radicalization being exported from any country for that matter, anywhere in the world, but it is also not that kind of power that believes in an idea of a regime change, right? So it will deal with the countries as they are existing in its current form. In terms of how India is dealing with extremism within India, treats it as a law and order problem, unless the extremists come trained from outside. And India has an experience of dealing with extremists who have come from outside, which is state-sponsored terrorism. So that's a different category, and I don't want to talk about that today. But in terms of extremism within, it deals it as a law and order problem. And here it becomes a question of simple state capacity. Right? And when we think about state capacity, India actually has a pretty low state capacity in police in terms of the number of policemen per 100,000. So that becomes a challenge. Let's stop here.
Would you like to add?
I think just to Sanjay's question about the Middle East, I don't know specifics around FTAs with individual countries, but what I would say is the relationships that this current Indian government has built up with some of those countries has they've been much deeper and much broader than previous administrations. So half an hour outside Abu Dhabi, there's a Hindu temple, Bab Swaminarayan Temple, and there's another one coming up elsewhere in the Middle East, I think in the next 2-3 years. Very unusually, well, firstly, it's the first Hindu temple there, certainly in the UAE, but maybe anywhere in the Middle East. Local police, as in not Swaminarayan devotees, but local police, man the entrance gate, and there's a huge police presence there. And that tells you how seriously the local government takes want it to be both hospitable, not have any diplomatic issues, and also make sure that the migrant workers that come and the other Indians that come, as well as the locals that might be visiting, they don't have any issues. So I think that doesn't happen overnight. That is a lot of diplomatic conversation over many, many years. And that's something, particularly in that region of the world, the Indian government has done really well. And the human rights question, I think, as we heard, it's very much a law and order issue. It touches earlier on the question here about radicalization of young people. There's a jump from that to the explicit law and order issues that it causes, but India's 1.5 billion people. It's had law and order issues, in the northeast, all along the border, with tribals in the center of India, as well as in J&K. So India's pretty well experienced with that.
Any other questions? We'll have one from there and one from there and one from here.
Sorry, the awkward angle, but thank you so much. I'm Madan, I'm the president of FINSA actually. I want to ask more of an economic question since I'm an econ student at King's. The PPP of India today is at about 10,000 USD if I'm not wrong, and the US is about 60K. We're 6 times away from PPP in terms from the US. Are we really overstating our economic growth in terms of when we say our GDP trends have been phenomenal, they continue to be phenomenal, but are we also overstating them because purely we're just escaping the Malthusian trap and it's just more people, it's simply more people producing more goods and hence the GDP rising and not per se being more output being driven? That's about it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Can you see me? My name is Hari. Thank you for the talk. I'm a student from SOAS. So my question is related to the friendshoring project that was initiated under the Biden administration. That was supposed to diversify supply chains away from China. Now with Trump being nationalist and America acting as protectionist, how do you see it impacting India's manufacturing plans?
Thank you very much for sharing your time and insights. I studied law and geopolitics, so it's kind of a different angle, but anyway. So I was just wondering, you've mentioned twice like common interest rather than common good, and I was wondering if you can elaborate on that, and more specifically, how might other countries be encouraged to adopt that approach as well if it is seen as being more successful?
Okay, so shall I answer the last question first?
Please do.
Okay, so when we talk about common interest rather than common good, it's about being a little practical. Because things are changing and it's an uncertain world. It's a wait and watch kind of a situation. So I would therefore, I would probably bat for India going into partnerships with other countries where its interests are served, rather than looking at the big picture, because there's no right or wrong currently as we see. So I would say that common interest is a better word than common good, because what is good for one section of the population may not be good for the other one. So I think that degree of pragmatism, striking a balance between pragmatism and idealism, I think that's what I mean when I say common interest rather than common good.
Quickly, I think we spoke earlier when the panel started about this issue about GDP per capita, and we kind of acknowledged that we should not overstate India's mind. So we kind of acknowledged. So you probably were not there in the beginning and you came in later. On the friendshoring business, back in 2016, when I was teaching in Singapore during the first Trump administration, I was teaching about the Trump presidency, and I forgot to kind of fill up the slide. It said Trump presidency, and it was a blank slide. And so I was like, oh shit. So I turned to my class and I said, everything I say about Trump, I don't know what to say about him. And the class lapped it up, right? Which is because he's so unpredictable. So I think in terms of what you're talking about Trump and the challenges that India has to face, I think we're still in very early days, as was said earlier in the panel. There's too much of uncertainty about what Trump's China policy is like. Everybody is trying to look out for that. There's not very clear indication on what the China policy is looking like. And there's all kind of speculation. So I think the Indians have engaged with the Trump presidency. And I think the Indians would hopefully not be surprised by anything that Trump does. But I still think it's too early to talk about the outcome of the friendshoring strategy.
And I think the next 1 year is going to be very crucial. We will be seeing lots of changes, huge dynamic shifts, but we don't know which. It's a wait and watch situation. We're not kind of soothsayers to say what's going to happen in the future.
So to the point about GDP per capita, you're right. We did touch on it earlier, but For example, labor productivity in India is probably about $7 an hour. In China, it's $28. In the US, it's $60. So India's far behind. GDP per capita for Telangana is 6 times that of Bihar. Out of about 800 districts across India, probably 20 or 30 of them pay 50% of India's taxes. So there's a huge amount of disparity. Youth unemployment is the highest it's been for, I don't know, several decades for sure. Female participation in the labor force is about 20%, 25%. So if India didn't fix anything else, but got double the number of young people working, regardless of wage rate, and double the number of women working, regardless of the wage rate, probably GDP would go up, GDP growth would go up a full 0.5 percentage point or 1 percentage point without much of an issue. So I think that there are, India does have a risk of sometimes overplaying its hand. But having said that, I think the headline figures are right. India's economic growth is the highest amongst major economies. The richest man in Asia is Indian. The second or third richest man in Asia is Indian. Partly it's because China has made its billionaires so much poorer through government action over the last few years. So India's have leapfrogged. But yes, absolutely, take your point.
So I think on that note, we're ready to end with the pledge that I think Indians over here and around the world should work harder than ever before, because we've got unprecedented opportunity in front of us and it's all to play for. I hope all of you will join me in thanking our panelists for an absolutely fantastic